Hello again, YouTube. Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. Today we are going to be talking about debate that actually happened back in, I believe it was January, but I wasn't doing YouTube videos back then. So I'm going to cover it today because I think it's as relevant now as it was back then, and it's still very interesting. And I feel that a lot of the topics, a lot of the issues raised are still just as relevant in the political discourse right now, and explain a lot of the animosity that we see between basically paleoconservatives, isolationists and whatnot, and then on the other hand, neoconservatives, capitalists, and everything else. It is a debate between these two that, even though they're both on the right wing and they're both conservatives, really illustrates and gives credence to the idea of what some people call horseshoe theory. But I reject the idea of horseshoe theory because in horseshoe theory you have the political spectrum actually curves down, where there's less of a distance between the far left and the far right than there is, say, between the far right and the center, or the far left and the center. I reject that because I conceive of it as more of a circle where the far right and the far left become almost indistinguishable at the bottom. The only debate that I'm having with myself over how to conceptualize it is over whether or not I see the political spectrum as a circle or as like a very eccentric ellipse where it kind of scales down, where there's a lot more difference between the far left and the far right versus, say, an equal difference within a circle, but where the difference between the far right and the far left is indistinguishable. In either case, the center is still the furthest point from the extremes, and the extremes are still infinitely close together. And so that's kind of how I conceptualize the political spectrum. When I look at this debate between Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro that aired on Fox News, the debate, as I mentioned, it's between two people on the far, or not on the far right, but just on the right in general. It kind of shows that there isn't really that much difference between the far left and the far right, because Tucker Carlson is giving arguments that more or less, when we look at the substance of what is advocated, are almost indistinguishable from socialist. If you replaced him with a socialist, for example, making these arguments. Now, Tucker Carlson in this debate gives a lot of religious rhetoric. He gives a lot of socially conservative rhetoric about the idea of tradition and nationalism and everything. And initially, to a lot of, say, American viewers, that might seem, well, that's actually pretty far from the left. But no, in the broad scheme of things, when we look at socialist systems, when we look at far left systems, usually they either go one of two ways. They're either staunchly atheistic systems where they establish an equivalent for religion in the personality cult around the great leader, or they do happen to incorporate religion. So, for example, a lot of socialist governments in Latin America have historically actually become comfortable with things like the Catholic Church. And so it is definitely possible, and there are many people out there in the world that are staunchly socialist, that have that staunch sort of anti-liberal value system with respect to the economy, that also are staunchly socially conservative and embrace old school tradition and religious institutions such as the Catholic Church. Those two are very compatible ideologies, but it's also very compatible to have a very staunchly atheistic socialist state that just has the great leader as the sort of divine entity and whatnot. So in this case, though it is Ben Shapiro debating Tucker Carlson, we could in many ways replace Tucker Carlson with somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, or another person on the left, Jill Stein, as I call her, Kremlin shill Jill Stein. We could replace Tucker Carlson with her. Tanky Tulsi Gabbard. We could go in a number of different directions. We could replace Tucker Carlson here with Tanky Jeremy Corbyn, for example. And there might be some stylistic differences. There might be some different rhetorical sort of claims or appeals to tradition or something. There might be a somewhat different sort of take where it relates to the symbols that are used. But the substance of the economic arguments, and actually the substance of a lot of the social arguments, is going to be more or less roughly identical. And so it was interesting here because you have almost a debate between the center-right and the far left occurring on Fox News. But it's not Tucker Carlson interviewing, some long hair, college-age hippie or something, right? Like if I say, a debate happened on Fox News, and there was a center-right guy, and there was a far-left guy, a lot of people might think of that if they don't know any of the context around the debate and think, oh, well, it's probably Tucker Carlson, the host, on the center-right, interviewing some crazy, SJW or whatever on the far left. But no, actually, my case here is that I'm going to argue that Tucker Carlson, you can call him far right, or you can call him far left in a way, but it's almost indistinguishable because the center-right person in this argument is actually Ben Shapiro. And so I'm going to demonstrate here and illustrate here how the points that Ben Shapiro's making are ultimately center-right sort of arguments, and that the points that Tucker Carlson goes on to make are basically indistinguishable from socialist arguments. And so what I found interesting about it, I do not like Tucker Carlson. I'll say that in full disclosure right here. I basically disagree with him on all the three primary spectra of the sort of political sphere. So for example, on social issues, he's a staunch social conservative. I'm a social liberal. On economics, I argue he is basically a national... I use this in the literal term, and I'll illustrate it more in this video. He's essentially a national socialist. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of like the anti-Semitic goose-stepping Nazis. I mean it as in he's a nationalist who wants the central government to do public works projects to benefit his interest group, which in his case happens to be uneducated white males. He's open about that. That's not some sort of allegation that I'm making that to discredit him or anything. He would embrace it. He would say, yes, that's my fan base. That's who those are the people for whom I'm trying to be the champion. That's what he would say, basically. So in that sense, I'm basically accurately representing his political position there. And then, of course, the third spectrum is the foreign policy angle. And on that, he happens to be essentially an isolationist, and I fall somewhere between a liberal hawk and a neoconservative. And I've got issues with both liberal hawkism and neoconservatism, but I'm somewhere in between them. I'm ultimately more realist than a liberal hawk and more secular and socially liberal than a neoconservative. But as it relates to foreign policy, so myself and Tucker Carlson, we're on basically all opposite ends. There's very little overlap between us. The only overlap that might be there are some default sort of assumptions that people tend to take for granted, like the right for a nation to defend itself. I assume he believes in that, even though he's an isolationist. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and believe and argue, for him that he would argue, of course, if America's attacked, America has the right to defend itself. Another default that would probably, that he and I would probably share, that's just usually kind of taken for granted, is we probably both believe in the idea that there should be some form of democratic system. That's probably a default. The only question is just what does that democracy look like? Because America at its founding was a democracy, but black people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, etc. But it was still a democracy. Athens was a democracy, but only land-owning males were eligible to vote. So we would probably both agree that a popular system in terms of a representative government is a good thing. We might disagree over the extent to which the population should be franchised. That's probably an area of disagreement. But I'm just trying to make the point here that apart from some of these defaults that people don't usually ask in debates, they're usually just kind of assumed we both agree on this kind of thing. You know, we both believe the law of gravity. We both believe the Earth is round. Apart from that, there's really no overlap between myself and Tucker Carlson. So that's like my bias here. But I'm also not really that much of a fan of Ben Shapiro. Like, I watch some of his videos. I watch his review of things like pop culture and whatnot. I find a lot of it honestly cringeworthy. I mean, he and I come from very, very different worldviews. So him and, like, Ben Shapiro and I almost, for the most part, we agree on economics. We both believe in liberal capitalism, but he believes in, like, the staunch social conservative, anti-secular sort of idea. And I believe in a socially liberal, secular society. On foreign policy, I don't know too much about Ben Shapiro's foreign policy here, so I'm not going to speak to that. But in full disclosure, these are my biases with respect to these two people they're going to be debating. So I'm going to break down their argument now. So Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro are largely arguing over economics, and they're arguing over Trump, they're arguing over populism, they're arguing over the idea of what does it mean, what does the social contract of America look like? In other words, if you're born in America, what are you entitled to by the innate virtue of being born an American? Ben Shapiro argues that the only thing that America as a society should guarantee to all of its citizens is basically the term that he used was basically the freedom to live your adventure, the freedom to grow character, the freedom to, lift yourself up by the bootstraps, basically. Like, he has a somewhat more libertarian view of capitalism than I do. We disagree on the extent to which regulations should be in place. But his view of America largely views America in the sense of a laissez-faire, liberal, Adam Smith, Milton Friedman type of background. That's sort of the tradition from an economic standpoint that Ben Shapiro is coming from. And so I'm more sympathetic to his line of argument. Now, I think he's a bit extreme in terms of the libertarianism of it. I think that there should be some sort of social safety net. The social safety net that for which I advocate is universal basic income. I think that if you did away with all the means-tested bureaucracy, if you did away with the Social Security, if you did away with all these very expensive programs that all have these various conditions in order to be eligible, and they're all means-tested, so they often stigmatize people. I believe that if you just had a right as a citizen to say, as Andrew Yang is proposing, $1,000 a month, that would ultimately, in the long run, eliminate poverty and not so much serve as a safety net anymore, but to just serve as a spur of entrepreneurship. Because if you don't have to worry about basic needs, you're able to start businesses and take risks a lot better. I view universal basic income as actually augmenting and providing a more healthy and imbuing more vitality to capitalism and actually perfecting the capitalist experiment. Whereas Ben Shapiro comes at it from a lot more of a libertarian sort of viewpoint. But Tucker Carlson, his tradition, well, some of his arguments come from a Keynesian background. Maybe he doesn't come from a sort of like a Hayek or a Milton Friedman background. He comes from a more Keynesian background. But it's different in the sense that the manner in which Keynesianism is generally applied and the people in the Keynesian tradition, like John Robinson, a number of others, they tend to be, definitively lefties. They tend to have this sort of nominally progressive agenda where they value all the citizens equally, and they have this idea of like the great national project is benefiting all the citizens, and they have the idea of equal rights for everybody. The exception, of course, is that some people in the Keynesian economic tradition, such as Joan Robinson,